We're rolling.
All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the last talk in track 2. I started too soon. Take 2. Good evening. Thanks for coming here and not going to the badge panel. I'm figuring they're probably explaining all the hidden tricks and gimmicks of these things. So I appreciate that. The topic of the talk is, does DoD security work in the real world? My name is Jeff Mann. I am a curmudgeon. And here's my current contact information, which is mostly Twitter these days, since I'm currently unaffiliated. Many people do Security Weekly. I'm a host on that occasionally. And apologize for the screen not showing everything at the top. You're not gonna miss much, but watch the replay. I wanted to start off just real quickly with just a quick audience survey. When you hear the question, does DoD security work in the real world? Is your answer yes? Show of hands. How about no? How about you're waiting for me to tell you? And who cares? Let's get to the bar. All right. I want to start by telling a little bit about myself, and it's not so much just, because I'm egocentric, but it's, the reason I'm talking about DoD security is I got my start in security in the DoD many years ago. So there's a method to my madness here. I've been in the InfoSec business for going on 35 years now. Started with the DoD, spent 13 years there primarily with the National Security Agency. You want to ask questions later, again, find me at the bar. I left the agency a little over 20 years ago, went out into the private sector, and initially I was doing pen testing, vulnerability assessments, explaining to people why if they're going to connect to the internet, they need things like firewalls and scanning and some sort of basic protection. And went from there. Somewhere along the line, I got into PCI. I ended up doing PCI for 10 years. And for the last several years, I was working as a strategist and a PCI subject matter expert for a vulnerability management vendor whom I will not name since they released me. But you can figure it out if you Google me. Just real briefly, just because this is a hacker conference and people care about this kind of stuff. Has anybody ever heard of this book called Dark Territory? It came out a little over a year ago by Fred Kaplan. About a couple. The Secret History of Cyber War. In this book, there is chapter 4, I believe it is, it's entitled Eligible Receiver. Within that chapter, there's this paragraph, and in the middle there, you can read it. The NSA had a similar group, yada yada, red teaming, located in Phoenix, and so on and so forth. And you get down to this part where it says the red team worked out of a chamber called the Pit, which was so secret that few people at NSA knew it existed. I'm here to tell you today I was one of the founders of the Pit and one of the original members of the first red team at NSA. And we did operate it out of the Pit. It was our office. We sat in cubicles, and we were trying to live the hacker culture, so we named our office. We called it the Pit. This is the FanX complex. Has anybody ever been to Maryland, flown in or out of BWI Airport? This is right outside of BWI Airport. These buildings are still there today. And the Pit was right there in the corner of that building. That was FanX 3. So true story for what it's worth. I want to pause here a minute. There's a small group of aging industry professionals known as curmudgeons that usually get together at RSA conference every year and lament about the state of how very little has changed in the industry, but we still try. And Becky Bass was one of the members of the curmudgeons. She passed away several weeks ago. She was one of my mentors. She was behind the scenes as we were setting up red teaming at NSA and getting started down the road of pen testing and hacking. And she was greasing the skids with management and the lawyers in particular. And just sort of watched over us. And through the years, she's always kind of watched over us as we ventured out into the private sector. So I just wanted to dedicate this talk to her. If you're unfamiliar with her, she's had a website for years. Her company was called Infidel, and you can go to the website infidel.net. They've kind of dedicated the whole site to her. They're putting up pictures of her, remembrances. A lot of people have written about her. I forget the name of the person or the link, but there's somebody that did an interview with her some years ago. Fascinating. If you're interested in this industry, find it. It's an oral history of InfoSec. It was basically an interview of her. Highly encourage you to go find it and read it. So this is for you, Becky. So I got my start working basically out of college. My senior year, I started in 1984. And I didn't actually start at NSA. I got a summer intern job, and you can't see the name of the place, but this is a facility that's in Maryland. It was called at the time the Naval Surface Weapons Center. So it was all about the Navy and torpedoes and guns on ships and all sorts of fun stuff, and mines. And my job as a summer job was working for a physicist that was doing anti-submarine warfare. He was doing anti-submarine warfare research. Fascinating topic. When I met him the first day, he said, the best way to explain what we do is this book just came out recently. You might as well just read it. It was The Hunt for Red October. Has anybody ever read that book? Or at least seen the movie? It was at the time pretty revolutionary because the author, I'm sure you guys know, Tom Clancy, writes fictional novels, but it's based on as much truth as you can get a hold of from open source collection, what we would call OSINT these days. So I read the book, fascinating book. I was like, this is great, I'm getting paid to read a book my first week on the job. This is a cool summer assignment. But this physicist had been able to get together some money and go out and buy one of these newfangled things called a desktop computer. I'm pretty sure that's the model that I was using. It dual booted between DOS and CP/M. You could pick your operating system. And it had some rudimentary early database programs. And basically what he wanted me to do was he had a filing cabinet that he had been amassing research material over the span of, probably 25, 30 years. Articles, reports, books, a lot of stuff had been checked out of the technical library of the research facility. To my chagrin, some of the material I was looking at was actually checked out before I was born, which kind of like, wow, my whole life, and this document's been sitting in this safe. But that was my summer job. Go through all the materials, try to catalog it, and come up with some sort of rudimentary database that you could make some use and justify the expense of buying that PC, which was probably, probably $5,000 or $6,000, if not more at the time. So my story begins by a lesson that I learned at the very beginning of my career. You can read it there. But basically, I got in trouble with security because I came in one morning. I opened up the safe and I found this slip of paper inside the safe saying, please come to the security office. And it turns out I'd left the safe unlocked. I was actually talking to the safe cracking guys last night about that safe. And that was similar to the one that I had, although we zoomed in, it was a much newer lock. But in the old days, it was like some of the ones that he had out there where if you don't spin the tumblers enough, you can slide it back and it really hasn't set. And so I'm guilty. But I was young, I was a kid, I was in college. I'm like, what's the big deal? I'm working in a facility that's got a fence around it. It's got perimeter protection. It's got a gate at the entrance to the building. You have to get past security, through some sort of a checkpoint. The door of the office had a lock on it, and the security guards obviously would walk the halls at night. So I was like, what's the big deal? So I left the safe open. Isn't the whole building secure? What's the risk that something bad happened? So remember that. We'll come back to that later. But that was sort of my first lesson in security, was guilty. I got reprimanded. In fact, I did it twice. And for the physicist, I thought he would be apoplectic the second time. One time he could forgive me, the second time. So I learned a lesson. So in trying to answer this question, does DoD level security work in the real world? If I were you, I'd be asking me to define my terms. What does it mean, DoD level security? And what does it mean, the real world? So, real quickly, real briefly, the real world, I mean the commercial world, non-government. Sometimes it's called the private sector, sometimes it's called the public sector, go figure, I don't know. All these terms are interchangeable. But I think most people that I've talked to over the years about DoD level security, especially in my consulting career, they sort of had this attitude and perception that DoD level security was ultra expensive, ultra complicated, very, very cumbersome. And basically it was this nth degree, this extra level of security that only the government could afford. Anyone, I like to pop movie trivia. Anyone got this? Yes, shout it out. Spinal Tap. Very good. When I grew up in working in the DoD in the early years of my professional career, there were many aspects, many sciences, cultures to this whole thing that we called security. These are just some of them. Some of these are newer than others. I just Googled and tried to find as many as I could to fill the slide. But when I started, especially at NSA, it was communication security. We called it ComSec. Later it became InfoSec, information security, and so on. OPSEC is what we, that's just monitoring the behaviors of the adversary or whoever you're interested in to see if you can learn anything about what's going on based about their behaviors, so on and so forth. Each one a discipline, each one that had offices and people that specialized in these specific things. So there's a lot to it. There's many elements to it. But it all boils down to what we used to call the risk equation. And there's many risk equations out there. If you Google it, you'll find all sorts of very complicated algorithms, and I'm not a mathematician. I play one on TV because I'm a cryptanalyst. But it all boils down to its very basic elements. When I try to explain it to people, it's all about risk, and the risk is the risk of something bad happening that you don't want to have happen. And the likelihood that that happens at its most basic level is some combination of the vulnerabilities that exist within your system, in addition to the threats against your systems, who wants to do something bad to you or make that risk happen, countered by what we used to call countermeasures. And these are most basically defined like this. And if you ever go to an industry conference, that's more the vendor side, more the business side, not necessarily the hacker side, and you see companies advertising that they specialize in vulnerability or threat this and that or the other, go up and ask them what is threat? Ask them to explain it. You'd be amazed at, especially because you're usually talking to a marketing person, how they stumble over a basic definition of what it is that is the core competency of their business. Just a sidelight. I've done that. I do like to troll those types of companies. But a vulnerability at its basic element is a weakness. A threat, the way I learned it, was the who. It was the bad guy. It was somebody that wants to do something to you, or somebody that wants to steal your data, or it's your adversary, DoD, national security. Nothing like that's going on these days in media or in the public realm. And the countermeasures could be many different things. In our industry, we're familiar with countermeasures being vulnerability management, reducing all the vulnerabilities, plugging all the holes, writing secure code. But it's also the things that you do to protect yourself, the security solutions, the myriad tools and products that are out there to do this, that, and the other thing. And it also maybe just be detection. It's anything that you do to try to compensate for the existence of vulnerabilities and threats, to try to bring everything down to a lower level that reduces your risk. What's important to remember about the DoD version of this is when it comes to national security and risk, what you're basically talking about, and there's exceptions to everything, but the basic rule is you're talking about human lives. You're talking about U.S. citizens, you're talking about U.S. interests, you're talking about employees in the State Department, and the DoD, intelligence agents, the military. It always boiled down to really trying to protect human lives. And not that there's unlimited budgets, or there ever was, but it was kind of like you have to do this at all costs. Security is just something you do because the risk is the loss of human life. So keep that in mind. The idea of security is also basically focused around data, and hopefully you guys are familiar with the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, CIA. These are sort of the three elements of data security. Now, data is in the electronic and in the internet world, in the digital world, we've got a few new variations, but historically, the elements of security of data fall into these three categories. Somebody's trying to steal the data, somebody's trying to alter the data, somebody's trying to prevent the data from getting to you. I mentioned earlier I was a cryptanalyst. My first tour, my first assignment at NSA was working on the defensive side, producing crypto systems. I actually worked in the manual crypto system shop, so we did things like produce one-time pads and made sure that they got out securely distributed, just kind of like key management, because a one-time pad is basically a key out to the consumers, out to the users, which is primarily the military. Anybody know what a one-time is? Anybody not know what a one-time pad is? It is the most secure form of secure communication that exists. As long as you use it once, and as long as the key is random, or some reasonable facsimile of random, you keep it out of the bad guy's hands, it's unsolvable. It's not cryptographically breakable. It's not brute force breakable. You can spend the rest of your life trying to all combinations. There's no such concept of all combinations. It can't be broken. Perfect security. My perspective, since I started that, and we've evolved into the internet, and applying cryptography in other ways, secure websites, passwords, so on and so forth, because it's all machine generated, because it's all man-made, because it's all man-made random, it's all computationally feasible that it can be broken, if given enough time, given enough computing resources. So my attitude has just been downhill ever since. So that gives you a little bit of a picture of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about DoD level security. The reason I came up with this talk is because probably about 8 years ago I was working with a customer in the PCI world. They were a major retailer. They were one of the retailers that actually had gone through a pretty significant breach in the late 2000s. Albert Gonzalez was the perpetrator, they called him. But they, like many companies in the commercial, private, public world, whatever you call it, security wasn't really a core competency. They were a retailer. They sold merchandise, and of course they were trying to figure out ways to do it more efficiently and make more money. So they, attached to the internet. The internet was being used for transactions. They had locations all over the country, and it was computers attached to the internet and all sorts of things. And so they got breached. Why? Because security wasn't a core competency. They didn't focus on that because they just sell women's underwear or whatever it was they sold. So I was having a conversation with them one day, and I was trying to walk them through the various PCI requirements. And I think we were talking about encryption, my favorite topic, and I was explaining what the options were for protecting data at rest, because encryption is one of the options. There's other things that you can do. And I was kind of, they kind of didn't know what any of the terms meant, so I was just walking through explaining it all to them, and I said, well, that's kind of what you need to do to your data at rest. And the guy kind of shrugged and said, yeah, but we don't need DoD level security. And that stuck with me. And that especially stuck with me the last couple of years when there's been, so many breaches. But again, retailers, they say, well, we just sell this. Security is not our core competency. And I need to readjust because I was getting ahead of myself in the slides. I apologize. But the argument they gave me at the time, we don't need DoD level security, was we're just a merchant. We sell cigarettes, we sell gas, we sell food, whatever it was. Security isn't part of their business. And as I've asked people, as I've talked about giving this talk, and what I've experienced in my career is, security is expensive, security is a hindrance. What's the ROI? There is no ROI. It's just a cost. It's complicated. It's not what they want to do. Too often the companies just want to do the bare minimum, whatever the companies are. It's not entirely true. It depends on the industry. But I have yet to go to a customer, with few exceptions, that really embraced security the way that I learned it back in the DoD. So now back to where I was. In the last couple of years, with all the major breaches that have happened to large companies, in the PCI world, it started in 2013, 14, the Target breach, the Home Depot breach, Neiman Marcus, The list seems to go on and on. Craig's on security, rarely a week goes by where there isn't some major breach announced. And those are only the ones that you hear about. You hear about in the media the big companies, the little guys that do security even less and rely even more on the technology or a third party that's saying, here, use this and you're fine. They're getting popped all the more. For every merchant you hear about, there's probably 2 or 3 dozen smaller companies that you haven't heard about that are going through the equal amounts of pain, if not more, because they're getting breached as well that nobody cares about. But so my thought the last couple of years, because this guy, what he said to me 8, 9 years ago, is always stuck in my brain, and I'm thinking, you don't really need security, DoD level security? Yeah, you really do. And as an example, this is a redacted network diagram. It's a few years old. I'm sure they're in the cloud now and things. But this was the typical network diagram of a retailer that I've worked with. They have a couple different basic network layouts or topologies for a couple different types of stores. And the stores would talk back to some sort of data center, which was, might have been co-load, it might have been on premises. Nowadays it'll be in the cloud. And ultimately it's getting back to their databases, which might be running on a mainframe. And if you're not familiar with PCI, one of the games of PCI is to reduce scope, to isolate your network to only the systems that touch credit card data, and that's all you have to worry about. That's the belief. And so this was an attempt to identify what they call the cardholder data network, or the CDE, which is where all the red circles are. Clearly, that's a highly isolated, segmented network. There's not a whole lot of crossover. It's a little bit complicated. There is no, here's the PCI on the left, and here's everything else on the right. It's all intertwined and complicated. And because of this, very often companies get breached. As I came out into the private sector, one of my goals as a consultant was to try to teach commercial companies the wisdom of security and how to do security right. They've been doing business, they've existed for a while, now they're getting on the internet, they're getting involved with technology. They need to start with a plan, they need to start with a policy, they need to understand that security is a process that has to be followed. And the lack of that and the lack of interest, or the belief that it's too hard, too complicated, we don't have the resources, we don't have the money, it basically boils down to just tell me what I want to buy, I want a box, drop it in, and I'll be good. That's basically the attitude that I got time and time again. And what I try to do is get beyond that, and with limited success sometimes, and most of the time the companies learned the hard lesson because they went through a breach, then they were ready to listen. But what I want to focus on for the next little bit is taking what I've learned over the years of DoD level security and see if there's some way to apply that to where we are today. Given the limitations, given the lack of awareness, the lack of commitment, the lack of institutional knowledge of security in so many different companies. And I don't intend for this to be necessarily, I'm telling you the way it should be. I really want us to just try to rethink security, because I think most of us would agree that more times than not, everything's broken these days, especially when you go to hacker conferences. You hear over and over again how easy it is to break into things, how often you're breaking into things because of some very basic misconfiguration or some basic password mismanagement or lack of a password. I mean, that's the way we were breaking in 20, 25, 30 years ago. And when it hasn't changed a whole lot these days, on Security Weekly, we've had various people come on and talk about studies they've done, they're pen testers, and they've gone back and looked at their customers. And very often the way they're breaking in is the same way we've always broken in. Missing passwords, guessing passwords, basic misconfigurations, stuff that just we should have taken care of already as organizations that are engaged in commerce in this digital world. So I want to throw out some ideas with the goal of, and I'm not convinced we can do this or not, but are there principles, is there a way of thinking about DoD level security that has yet and can still be applied in the commercial world? Because, my God, for 25, 30 years we've been doing it a certain way, and we don't seem to be getting any better as a collective. And so that's where I'm going. Feel free to disagree, and hopefully we'll have time for discussion and comments. Feel free to push back and ask questions. I'm throwing these out as ideas, coming from my long history of and where I've come from, how I was classically trained. Does anybody know where this is going?
Sneakers.
Sneakers. And the message of sneakers is it's all about the information.
I was answering
With the comments. Gosh, I don't remember the name. Who's Cosmo? Is that Ben Kingsley?
Ben Kingsley.
And what's Robert Redford's
Martin.
name?
Bishop.
Martin Bryce or Martin Bishop.
Okay. So Marty, he's telling Marty, right? So Cosmo is saying to Marty, there's a war out there, old friend, a world war. And it's not about who's got the most bullets. It's about who controls the information. What we see and hear, how we work, what we think, it's all about the information. So I think most of us would still agree that's true. There's some nuanced differences these days, and certainly there's different ways that the companies are disrupted these days, but historically and classically, a lot of it has to do with data and information. And still a lot of crime that is committed is the theft of data. It might be personal data, it might be credit card data, it might be healthcare data, whatever it is, it's still data. So let's look at the risk-based model again. I've been out in private industry over 20 years. People talk about risk all the time. Vulnerabilities, it's all about vulnerabilities. We've got vulnerability scanners, vulnerability management, pen testing. There's a lot of emphasis on vulnerabilities with the idea of reducing them. You reduce vulnerabilities, you reduce your risk. Everybody agrees with that. In the last couple of years, there's been more emphasis on threats. There's been more technologies that have come out. So there's threat detection, there's threat identification, there's threat agents, there's, help me out, there's threat out the wazoo, especially if you go to the industry conferences and hear the marketing pitches. Again, not so much to, and again, I don't think they understand, it's not always that you reduce the threat, it's you identify the threats and you know that they're there so you can counter them. And the countermeasures, the whole industry has grown up about producing countermeasures. But what's different about the risk model in the commercial world, and this might be an insolvable problem, is risk in the commercial world is largely a dollar figure. Whereas in the government, if you recall, I said it's human life. But in the commercial world, these are companies most of them are for-profit. They're trying to increase revenue, increase profit margins. So everything that they do to try to drive down the vulnerabilities, drive down or identify the threats, apply different countermeasures, they all come at a cost. And they have to make, if they're smart about it, if somebody is presenting a risk model to them, they're making a financial decision at the end of the day. And something that they don't do necessarily is assign a value to the data that they're trying to protect. And this is a key area that I think is something that we can learn from the DoD. In fact, I was hearing a talk earlier, I think it was the DLB talk, where the presenter was talking a little bit about data classification. And that's kind of what I'm talking about. But as an example, you've probably all seen movies and you're familiar with the idea of confidential, secret, top secret. There's different levels of data classification. And we sort of have that in industry and in the commercial world, but it's usually public and private, or public and proprietary, or confidential. There isn't a huge amount of difference usually. There aren't many categories usually. And the big thing that's missing in terms of data classification is I don't see very often in the commercial world any sense of valuing the data or giving any thought to the life expectancy of the data. The best example I can give you from a DoD perspective is if you've ever seen a war movie, Vietnam movie, Korea, whatever, and you've got troops on the ground and they're in the middle of a firefight and they're calling in air support for an airstrike to take out the machine gun nest or the enemy. They're calling in coordinates and they want the airstrike to come in and get the bad guys and not the good guys. So those coordinates, that's data, and that's extremely important data to protect for maybe a half hour, maybe an hour, because once the airstrike's been called in, it doesn't really matter what the coordinates were. So there's a life expectancy. when you get into secret level of classification of data in the DoD terms, and who knows how much we're going to learn about this as certain current events unfold in DC that over the next days and weeks and months. But the idea of top secret information, or bring up the Hillary's email server. Top secret information, more often than not, the reason it's top secret is not the data itself, it's how we got the data. It's what we call methods and sources. It's we are tapping, or we have a bug in a particular room, in a particular building, in a particular city, in a particular country, and certain conversations are only happening in that room. So if the information is leaked and the people that were, one of 6 people that were having that conversation get wind of, hey, how did the U.S. get that information? They might conclude either A, somebody in the room tattled, shared the information, they're a spy, or maybe there's a bug in the room. Methods and sources. That makes the information more valuable. How does that translate in terms of the commercial world? Well, financial data, everybody understands, money is something that can be stolen, so you should protect it kind of forever. In the retail space, it was financial transaction records. A lot of companies, because of, help me out, is it SOX or SARP? It's SOX. They have to keep financial data a certain number of years, and so everybody keeps it for 7 years, and then they don't know what to do with it. And because they're not sure they've kept it long enough, they just keep it forever. They don't have any concept of end of life and let's destroy it, or it's not useful for information anymore. And in a hacking networking, we break into things that we really don't ever think about. I'm generalizing, and I apologize. We don't think about, in a corporate network, there's better data and there's less good data. If the goal is to steal data, or if the goal is to get access, alter the data, make the data not available. Because we know how easy it is to break into the networks. And if you can get anywhere in the network, you can more than likely pivot and get wherever you want to be in the network. And in the early days, it didn't matter as much because people were just breaking into the networks just to say, hey, I did that, check it out. Nowadays, people have figured out, the bad guys have figured out how to monetize data, so they're looking for data, and they're looking for ways to get the data out more efficiently and more cost effectively. They've got a risk model too. So the next element of DoD security that sort of plays into this, I'll put it that way. Machine's frozen. There we go. We've probably heard variations of just what we used to call security in depth. This is an aerial photograph of a city, I believe it's in Italy, and it was built sometime in the Middle Ages, so it's 500, 600, 700 years old. You can sort of see that there's layers there, and you can imagine that the king or the whoever the leader was of this city was probably in the innermost part if they were being attacked, and the further out you go, less important people were there fighting off the bad guys. And it's a combination of moats and walls and things like that. So layered protection, you've probably all heard variations of that. And a lot of people talk about how this has gone away, especially in today's cloud-connected world where infrastructure is now out there somewhere instead of the classic sense of perimeter. But the concept as it applies, especially to figuring out what's more important and less important in your network, I think still applies. And we would call it segmentation these days, like in the PCI world, separating things out. And I read an article recently that was talking about this a little bit, and they're saying, let's forget about the fact that the classic version of this is to try to slow down the adversary. Well, that's a significant point. We used to design systems where I used to work with this in mind, where another factor of how good the security was make it more costly and expensive and time-consuming than the value of the data was worth the adversary trying to go after it. And we usually, and we were doing nation states, and that was our adversary, and we would base our calculations based on what we used to call the gross national product, which is now called the gross domestic product. But basically, how much money does that country have, and how much are they willing to invest in trying to get this bit of information, given all these layers of protection? So it doesn't even have to be perfect security forever. It has to be long enough to make it not worth their while. The next element is, and I think this is probably the most important one, and the one that we probably have the most hope of implementing, and that is building into companies a culture of security, what I call a culture of security. Where I used to work in the DoD, the mission of the DoD was security. I mean, that was what we did. And it was part of the fabric, it was part of the culture, and everybody knew. So think back to my earlier story, and a lot of people have walked in. To recap real quick, my first job was a summer intern at a naval research facility, and I was going through classified material in a cabinet, filing cabinet, and I left it unlocked one night and I got in trouble. So I learned a lesson. And that lesson was there was a lot of other protections in place. And what I learned also was where there was all these other layers of protection where I thought, well, what's the big deal if one thing failed? The lesson I learned is the culture was there was a fence around the building, and it was a perimeter fence, and it was hundreds of yards away from the building, and it had barbed wire on it, and may or may not have had motion sensors on it, and it may or may not have had cameras on it. There were a lot of components and parts and processes to that one piece. And then, going inside the building and having to get through, past the front desk, past the turnstiles, past the security guard. We had badges, initially they were picture badges, then there were proximity badges, and then there were swipe badges. But there was layers of security with processes built around it. And, locking doors, isolating things to different areas, and not everybody got to go into every office. That's sort of that security in depth, that segmentation concept, changing the combination, not displaying it, not writing it, on the wall beside, keeping it secret. And even, the security guards. It was interesting, the security guards at most of the places I worked, they used to rotate them regularly, not to give them a break, but because they didn't want them to become familiar with you and you to become familiar with them. They didn't want you to, it's Jeff. He comes in here every day, and they just let me in even though I don't have my badge, and because I got fired and walked out the day before and they hadn't heard about it. They followed a process. They followed rules, and all the seemingly innocuous rules were followed because everybody understood that it all worked together to create this environment and this culture of security. And I didn't appreciate it at the time, everybody believed in it, and everybody did it, and everybody was trained on it, and everybody was aware of it and took it seriously. It wasn't, we got to do 20 minutes of security awareness training because it's a requirement, and I get yet another lecture about how my password should be longer than 4 characters.
What do they do with the cleaning people?
Various things. Depending on which organization I was in, they were cleared to some level. They might have been escorted. They usually had some sort of level of access, and security guards were aware of what they were doing. But that gets into a trust issue, and again, how much do you want to put into your cleaning people? And I've seen good and bad ways of implementing it. I used to teach when I first came out because I had all this knowledge and wanted to share it with the commercial world. We used to talk about this thing we call the security life cycle and how there's component parts. And most of the companies back then were just getting started on connecting to the internet. They had networks, they had computers, but they hadn't plugged it into the internet and opened this big gaping hole for bad guys to come in. So we tried to walk them through this process of getting a handle on where they stood, getting a handle on what they had to deal with. And a lot of it had to do with vulnerabilities, and a lot of it had to do with pen testing, and it was fun. But we always tried to move them on to, okay, now that we've found all the problems, let's systematically fix them and set you up in a way that's continuously improving and evolving. And that's evolved a little bit. Nowadays you've got the cybersecurity framework, and they've also got 5 steps, and they're slightly different but very much related, but very much technology oriented, not so much process oriented. Whereas we talked about the security life cycle, starting with a basic knowledge of what you're protecting, knowing what you're trying to protect. It could be data, it could be reputation, it could be research data, it could be personnel records. A lot of companies just don't know the value of the data and what they have their hands on, and they have no clue why anybody would want to steal it and nowadays make money off of it. Even customers that I had that were PCI customers, and at some level they knew it was the credit card data they were supposed to protect, and they knew that at some level. They didn't know where it was. They didn't know how many places it was being stored. They didn't know how many people were accessing it and making local copies on their desktop or on the local file servers, or yes, sometimes on their laptop that they walked home with every night, and so on and so forth. We taught, and I still teach, that security requires method, intention. There needs to be a systematic approach to security, and especially it involves all the non-sexy stuff that we don't like to do, like writing things down, documentation and policies and procedures and things like that. And somebody said this a long time ago, one of the first talks that I went to many years ago, a gentleman named Marcus Raymond, if you've ever heard of him, he said basically, I should really give him credit on the slide, but security without policy is simply technology. If you don't have a policy, his context was a firewall policy. If you don't have a written plan or guideline and you're implementing a technology solution, how do you know you're implementing it correctly or to meet the goals that you've set for yourself if you don't have some goals written? So, try to throw together some parting thoughts and throw some stuff out there, and then maybe we can ask some questions and get some discussion going. Very often, and this has been my experience, customers, they might have some concept of this whole security life cycle, but they're like, yeah, what do I need to buy? Where do I need to put it? How many? And I can set it up and I'm done. I have a blank, and so I'm protected. Unfortunately, because companies don't have the institutional knowledge, they go out to the community, and very often who they're talking to in the community is vendors. And very often the people that represent the vendors are the marketers and the salespeople that know how to say the words but don't always know what they're talking about. And vendors lie. And I've discovered after working for a vendor, it's not always that they're lying intentionally, it's because they just don't know anybody. They're knowing better. They're as uninformed, and they don't have the institutional background, just like the customers that they're trying to sell something to. There's also, I believe, too much of an emphasis on technology, and I know that's a risky statement at this type of conference, but if we're going to be honest with ourselves, we've been trying all this stuff that we've been talking about the last couple of days for 25, 30 years, and there's still pretty significant problems out there. And I think we could probably all agree that vulnerabilities are here to stay. So maybe, just maybe, we should focus somewhere else if we think back to that risk model. Maybe it's time to focus on another aspect. Doesn't mean we drop the vulnerability component, but maybe there's more to it than that. And like I said earlier, people don't know what the meanings of the words are. I hear people use risk and threat in particular interchangeably, like they're synonyms. They don't understand that one is a component part of the other. So, anybody know what that is? This is, it all started with that book up in the top left corner, which was called the Orange Book, which was first published, I'm going to say it was in the early 80s. And it was all the details you'd ever want to know about how to secure a computer, and then as it moved on, networks and all the different component parts. So there's a lot of work went into that. It was very exhaustive, and largely everybody agreed it was not achievable and it wasn't really useful. So that's what the government gives us, what some people think. But I saw this a couple weeks ago. Somebody, I think I saw it on LinkedIn. Somebody attempted to map out all the different things and components and technology. It's mostly technology based together. Everything that a CISO needs to know about. I don't even know if you can read any of it, but hopefully you can see it later on the video. So that's one example. And then I saw this a few days after that. Somebody tried to map out all the cybersecurity domains. There's a lot of crap to know about there for anybody that's trying to do this stuff. And is that better than what the government had to offer? I don't know. But if you go back to data security or information security, most people, especially on the consultant side, that are trying to work with companies to get them to a point, a lot of people in this industry will talk about its people, processes, and technology. People have heard that before, I hope. Of course, consultants tend to talk about the people and processes and pen testers and the hackers are focused on the technology, as well as the vendors that are selling all the solutions. I submit to you that all of those are important, but they're missing a key element, which is having that purpose. And your purpose not be the mission of the DoD, which is protect against nation states and human lives, but every company, every organization out there has a purpose. You should understand that. And based on that purpose, you should understand to what degree and what level you need to protect your data, which a lot of it has to do with. And then you start to make some informed and hopefully intelligent and well-reasoned decisions on what you invest in terms of people, processes, and technologies. So to sum up, I firmly believe technology is not the solution. It's really the problem. As near as I can tell, after almost 35 years, knowledge and awareness is the key. We got to make people smarter that work for organizations about how they fit into the machine that is their company, what they do and don't do, how that impacts the security of the company. Security is, I like to say, security is a verb. It's something that you do. And notice I never mentioned that word once in this entire presentation.
What word?
Just real briefly, I'm just the shameless plug. I'm being sponsored here this weekend by a company called Cyphercon. They're an open source online IT, technical, and hacker security training courses. You can sign up for free, and there's thousands of hours of courses that you can take. You don't necessarily get the certification on it, but it's free. You can watch all the videos that they have. This is a brief history. It's a new company. They've got over 950,000 subscribers. So new content gets put up in 24 hours, like 40, 50,000 people have watched it. They're trying to suck up as much as they can, and they're committed to keeping it open source and free. And this kind of fits in with what I'm saying about we need to spread the knowledge and the learning and get it out there. So again, questions and comments. I have no idea how much time we left, but there's nothing after me. So
About 10. About 10 minutes left.
Okay, cool. 10 minutes. Any questions, comments, disagreements? Yes, sir.
I just checked the title because I wanted to make sure I didn't misunderstand. But it was does it work? And I guess maybe it's just playing words. Is it needed? Yes. Does it work? I'm on the fence for various reasons because people, you've detailed a lot of them. People say too expensive.
Right.
We don't need that. That's where I have some trouble in answering that question. I guess that's a comment, less.
Yeah,
more a comment, less a question.
Again, I'm intending this to be a discussion starter because I think we need to try something different. Because what we've been doing for the last 25 years, while it makes a difference, technology keeps advancing. New technologies come out that might solve one problem, but they generally introduce 2 or 3 new ones. And if you think about it, vulnerabilities, the way we think of it as hackers and pen testers, are really features. Chew on that one a bit. Or I could say hackers, somebody asked me to define what a hacker was a couple months ago. And I said, well, they're basically somebody that knows how your technology works better than you do. And yet we continue to roll it out. And companies legitimately, I think there's a legitimate need for companies. I think they're justified in saying, I don't use stuff that's secure. I shouldn't have to know all this stuff. But that doesn't happen yet either. Yes?
So the purpose of all the technology we've built over the time period you're talking about, the purpose of it is not to be secure. The purpose is to achieve some result, right? Like whether it's...
I don't know. What is the purpose of all the tech? I'm an old curmudgeon, so I can say
no,
what is the purpose of all this technology?
But we don't build it to...
What is the purpose of Pokemon Go?
Right, but in the
Being
military...
Get off my lawn! I'm sorry, go ahead.
In the military to affect some, damage, or in the commercial space, a Tesla car, or pick a technology. It has
Right.
some purpose, and there's a lot of it, right, over that time period. I'd say, on the whole, while I don't disagree that InfoSec has basically repeated the same problems, I'd say the success of the technology over that time period and the benefits that people have seen have far outpaced the negatives from the breaches and the problems, which is why people have just continued to tolerate the InfoSec problems. Now,
Sure.
I have a question or a discussion point.
Okay.
So, The DoD, it seems like, has mitigated a lot of, they've embraced a lot of new technologies. Obviously, you got smart weapons, you've got, advancing technologies. But they do one thing very, very differently, which is their networks are not connected to other countries and to untrusted actors. If you're going to have a device, well, in the weapons,
We hope.
well, yeah, maybe the guided bombs are talking to Amazon now, but what little I've touched on, the
Does anybody
first
work
thing
for a backbone provider?
the first thing they do if you're going to deploy, okay, so I was involved in an unclassified project with Android devices in Afghanistan.
Okay.
And the first thing they did was drill the radio out of it. And the only way it could get online was connected to a secure laptop, which only connected to a DoD network. Basically, the network is the security in the DoD. What network are you on? And out in the commercial space, we're all trying to deal with the internet. And the problem I feel like we're facing now is, and it's exploding with IoT, is everything being connected and with no trust or real security in the protocols. And I think ultimately you're going to have the commercial space embrace more layering and more segmenting in networking. And there's going to be downsides for hackers and freedom of information. But I think, in the corporate space, you're going to start to see more of that because that's what's worked for the DoD.
So to tie your first comment together with your question and your last comment, another way of expressing what you expressed initially in terms of great successes is could be defined as people have made a lot of money off the technology because, again, the risk model in the commercial world is financial based, and that has outweighed the losses. It's another way of looking at it, right? And so your question about the security of the DoD is that it's a separate network. Well, we can start talking about the insider threat and having worked for the government many years, but the providers of the closed network were also the providers of the internet, and they swore up and down that they were separate. I worked for a telco for a while, and they had me do a security architectural review of another project that they were working on, which had to do with replacing the air traffic control systems, which is radar. They were trying to produce a GPS-based system, so they could have transponders in every plane. They could have all sorts of antennas throughout the country and at the airports. And one of the requirements of that system was that it was a closed network, completely isolated from the internet. And granted, it wasn't the DoD. You probably agree it's a highly sensitive system that needs to be nearly 100% available, which was one of the other requirements. One of our engineers, who were a subcontractor because we were the backbone, pushed a software update to the routers, the switches at all these different locations over a weekend and took the system out. It was beta, it wasn't live, it's still not live, I don't think. Took the system out for 18 hours. And when I was talking to him about it, he's telling me you got to be closed and 100% availability. And what I did was I was at home and I pushed this update. I'm like, time out. You were at home, so how did you get on this completely isolated network? He's like, well, I VPN'd into my account at the telco, and then I hopped over this, and I hopped over this. And I was like, but you did it from home. And he didn't understand what I was getting at. He really believed it was separate networks. I said, you were at home. You were dialed into your local ISP, or dialed in, that's my showing my age. Sorry. You were connected to your Wi-Fi, your local ISP, and you were manipulating the system that was supposedly 100% isolated from the internet, and he didn't get it. And I'm like, why are we having this conversation? So anyway, I'm sure the DoD is completely separate. Any other questions or comments? Yes?
So I feel like a lot of times as a group, as a community, we try to look at security as a binary thing. Something that is secure, it's not secure, this vulnerability exists or it doesn't exist. In some of my classwork, I had criminal justice training, and when they talked about security, it was much more of, okay, you have some sort of vulnerability, you have these 4 things that you're going to go through in a certain order, Are you going to eliminate the risk? Are you going to reduce it? Are you going to transfer it? Or are you just going to accept it? And I feel like we don't talk about that enough. Are you going to patch it or are you not going to patch it? That's it. And kind of in line with that, because of what we've done around the security, I had another professor who worked for a hospital for physical security, not for InfoSec, that didn't even like to use security. He called everything loss prevention. Loss prevention of human life, loss prevention of data, loss prevention of working time. So have you seen like being able to rephrase things to be able to kind of be in line with the way that some of the business already operates? Like maybe for retailers, they've got a loss prevention.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've spent a lot of years as a consultant trying to find ways to say things differently to get the point across. I do another talk called The Art of the Jedi Mind Trick, which is trying to convey some of the techniques that I've learned over the years. I mean, the first thing you said about the binary, absolutely. I mean, that's a way to sum up what I was saying. We kind of think all things are equal. You're secure or you're not secure, and we all agree you're not secure. You know, the second thing you said, the second professor, changing the words, making it something different other than InfoSec, that's assigning a value to the data effectively. I mean, and yeah, if the frontline approach and using all the terminology and buzzwords that we're familiar with isn't working and probably won't work, it's absolutely essential to try to come up with a way to make people understand. Because security at some level is just common sense. Security, when you can explain it effectively to people, whether they're technical or not, they get it. Oh, we're trying to prevent this from being stolen. Oh, this is valuable, we want to protect it. Break it down to its essential elements without getting mixed up in all the technology. Yeah, that's essential. It helps. Is it perfect? No, but it certainly goes better than blasting them with a lot of terminology that they don't understand. Any other questions or comments? Yes?
So I'm always absent in likelihood in my calculation of risk, and I've had a lot of passionate discussions with folks who don't think it's a large factor in calculation of risk. And comment on how that changes.
So, and I'm realizing I have been forgetting to repeat the question, so it's going to be a boring video when you watch it. So the question is, how does the likelihood factor into the risk equation? We did a lot of work with risk equations back when I was in the DoD at NSA, and we used to go down two threads. One was the likelihood that if somebody tried to do this attack or do this exploit, they would be successful. And it was like, how bad is the hole? How bad is the vulnerability? And that sort of roughly translates to those vulnerability scanners, whether it's CVE or CVS.
Oops. Hold the bottom button for about push it in for about 5 seconds.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
It might be just dead.
I can talk loudly.
Oh, there it is. A lot of the vulnerability rankings are basically the likelihood of success. If this is tried, it goes. But the other one was the likelihood that somebody would actually attempt to do the exploit. Sort of a different way of looking at it. So yeah, likelihood is something that's an important factor that's not always taken into account in a lot of risk equations. But there's 1,000 variations of the risk equation. Pick one and run with it. Any other questions? We probably should wrap up so we can go to the bar. Comments? Parting thoughts? Live long and prosper.